I'm very happy to introduce to us Pat Bernard from Vive Healthcare. So again, Vive Healthcare is a pharmaceutical company that is dedicated to HIV/AIDS research and treatment and to supporting people living with HIV/AIDS all across Canada. Please welcome Pat.
So, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jody and your team, for having us be part of this. I won't be as inspiring as the previous group, obviously, but I'll try to do my best. As previously mentioned, Vive Healthcare is 100% dedicated to HIV. We're discovering and hoping to provide new treatments for HIV that will hopefully make HIV a smaller part of people's lives. We're also involved in cure research. When we were created 10 years ago, what really talked to me is someone internally mentioning that Vive Healthcare is created to eventually put itself out of business. So hopefully we'll get there one day. But while we get there, we recognize there's a lot of work to be done around education, prevention, reduction of stigma. And I think conferences like these, like this one here, greatly contribute to it. So we're happy to be part of it. So thank you all for letting us participate in it. I would like to introduce now the next speaker, Rahim. He is a registered social worker who works as a therapist on a family health team at Sherburne Health Centre in Toronto. Also works as a consultant in a private practice. His work focuses on issues of anxiety, depression, trauma, body image, and problem substance abuse. He wears other hats. He is also a post-secondary instructor at Ryerson University in a BSW program and has developed a curriculum in the area of addiction and mental health at Centennial College. So Rahim is your next speaker. And just for the Francophone part, I'm available for translation should you need it. Because I'm also from Quebec, and sorry for the accent. Thank you very much.
Someone left their tea. All right. Let's just get this clicker going. All right. Thank you for having me here. It's a great honor. I think last year I jumped up to that mic, and when we were talking about mental health, and one of the things I said was, it's really great to hear about depression, anxiety, the things that we struggle with and live with, but unfortunately when we talk about mental health, it's often a diagnostic label and incidence or prevalence rates. So when I think about mental health, I'm thinking about who we are in our various contexts from day to day. So how do I feel when I'm with my family? How do I feel when I'm at home? How do I feel on the commute between home and work? How do I feel around certain people? What is it like when certain people bring out envy in me? What is it like when other people bring out anxiety in me? What is it like when I feel anxious and I'm unsure of what the source is, right? So I'm thinking about mental health in an exploratory way. And today I'm hoping to talk about shame in the vein of being exploratory around our mental health. So my name is Rahim, my pronouns are he and him, and that's enough, I think, in terms of an introduction. I want to give you a bit of a content warning. Shame is a heavy topic. I think a lot of things that we're going to talk about over the next couple of days are going to be heavy. And so I don't know what's going to trigger somebody or what's going to activate them, but I would encourage you to think about how to take care of yourselves and each other, maybe checking in with one another if someone you know is having a tough time. So I'm going to start with some of our takeaway messages, just so you know what the point is when I'm blabbering on in some of the sections. I think we encounter shame in a number of social experiences, particularly around sexuality and identity. I think in our culture we think that we can undo the shame, and we think we undo it by forming solid relationships, by seeking validation and receiving it, by having sex, by coming out, and even reclaiming our autonomy. So we do things that symbolize autonomy and independence, and by doing that, I think that we've undone the shame. We're more of the person we want to be. But I would argue that shame leaves an imprint on our lives and stays with us for quite a while. I think just like you protect yourself against your anxiety, for example, you might have a glass of wine, right, to ward it off. We do things to protect ourselves when we experience shame. But what's difficult is that some of the ways we protect ourselves aren't always helpful for us or our communities, right? So if I'm protecting myself against my anxiety with a glass of wine, not a big deal. If that turns into a dependency, it might not be helpful for me or could affect people around me. I think shame is deeply painful, but also very important to talk about. So I'm going to get us to start with an exercise. You don't actually have to write anything down, but the instructions say to. But you can also do it visually or in your imagination. So I want you to describe or identify a specific incident from your childhood in which you felt shame. Record what thoughts went with your feelings. Think about those feelings, write down the feelings and the thoughts you had during the specific incident. Think about the feelings and thoughts you had after that incident. What impulses did you have? Did you then want to move towards others, move against them, or simply move away from them? Think for a moment about that experience. And then notice, if possible, where you felt the shame in your body. If the feeling had a color, what would it be? What sound, color, texture, and temperature would it have? Lastly, write down or think about how you think that shame scene or that incident still influences you today. The impact can be something you like or something you don't like. How has it affected your relationships with others and yourself? Do people have a mental image of an incident that might have impacted them? Can I get a show of hands? You don't have to share, just a show of hands. Thank you. So what is shame, and why does it have such a lasting impact? I would say shame is very different from guilt. I feel guilt when I think I've done something wrong. I've gone against my own moral code. I stole when I shouldn't have. I lied when I really don't like to do that. But if I'm feeling shame or I'm experiencing shame, I'm likely thinking about myself as a fundamentally flawed person. I haven't done something wrong, but I am something wrong. And shame can take a number of forms. So I might experience it as embarrassment, humiliation, or rejection. Shame doesn't just exist out of nowhere. It comes up in the context of a social relationship. And so it's therefore a social emotion. I start to devalue myself as I internalize how I think you see me. I'll say it again. I start to devalue myself when I internalize the idea of how you see me. So I take your judgment and make it my responsibility to change, and then I start to see myself through your gaze, whether it's actually how you think about me or not. A psychologist named Jane Bolton talks about shame in quite a broad way, and so I appreciate some of what she's had to write about it. She talks about shame as occurring on a spectrum of intensity, if you will. So shyness can just be shame in the presence of a stranger, very basic. Whereas discouragement can be connected to feeling defeated, at least temporarily. Embarrassment might be like that moment when I told Dane that I'm going to a separate bathroom in case I have to fart. Right? So it's about embarrassment in the presence of others. I wouldn't feel embarrassed if somebody else wasn't there. It happens in the context of other people and what I think they're going to think about me, right? Self-consciousness is shame about performance. Will I be good enough? How will I be received? Will I be criticized? Now, inferiority is a kind of shame that's about all-encompassing devaluation of the self. So I'm inferior in many contexts of my life. I don't feel like I measure up. So that culminates in not just a social experience that's isolated to one incident, but a core belief then that I hold about myself as I move through the world. Well, how does shame develop, right? A lot of us put up our hands when we had this, did the little simulation exercise. Sometimes shame develops through simple experiences of somebody telling you no. Lots of kids will play with their genitals or touch their genitals in public at a young age, and a parent will say, no, don't do that. Somebody will be ill-mannered at the dinner table, particularly in a public restaurant, and they'll be punished. And parents experience a lot of pressure to do the punishing so that they're seen as good parents, right? And then children internalize a message of, oh, I really messed up. I must not be a good person. We're also socialized heavily into knowing and learning about what's good and bad without it actually officially being, there's nothing inherent that would say something is good or bad, right? So I know as my experience as a young Muslim man, I was told that alcohol was very, very bad. So when a lot of my peers were drinking alcohol, and I was drinking with them, they were having a great time, and I was feeling like a bad person. Now, someone might argue that, no, Rahim, you were actually just feeling guilt because you thought you did a wrong thing. Sure, but here's the overlap. Because when you think you failed an entire system, an entire way of being, that impacts how you feel about yourself on a more aggregate, a bigger level, right? For a lot of us queer guys, I think we internalize a lot of messages about the types of relationships that are good or bad, the types of sex that's good and bad, the forms of prevention that are good and bad. And so how many messages do we have to receive, or how often do we have to process if whether or not we're doing is actually bad? There's lots of socialization around privacy and secrecy. I find this to be a really interesting dichotomy. It's hard for me to know sometimes if I need to keep certain things private because they have to do with my personal imagination, my personal thoughts, my own fantasies, my own boundaries. Do I just have good boundaries? And do I have a right to that privacy? Or am I harboring a secret because I think that if I talk about those things, I will be punished in some way? I think a lot of us experience that in relationship communication. Should I share my masturbation fantasies with my partner? Is that private or is it a secret? And why is that distinction so important? Do I want to tell you about the casual sex I had at Queen's Park, popular park in Toronto? And do I not want to tell you because it's private and none of your business? Because that could be okay. Or do I not want to tell you because I think something should be kept secret because I feel ashamed about it? Some of us might have had a similar experience in terms of how we talk about family problems, money problems at home growing up. What is it that we're supposed to keep private, and what is it that we're supposed to keep secret? And what's the responsibility that comes with keeping things secret? And then finally, there are the non-shared experiences of boundary violations. So when we experience things like physical abuse or sexual abuse, and we don't have the opportunity to talk about it, we have very few resources then to make sense of what's happened to us. And those result in a lot of shame, because the only way we can understand them is by taking responsibility partially for what's happened to us, even though it's not our fault. And so then if I'm responsible for the transgressions against my own boundaries, my own body, I will likely experience shame being activated in a number of my interpersonal relationships. So how do I protect myself? How do we protect ourselves? What are our defenses against shame? Sometimes we punish or attack ourselves. We'll say, I'm not good enough. I'm bad at love. That's not my line. It's from a song. We say we're not good enough. We say we're not attractive, or that we need to do better. But we need to look better. We need to change who we are. Changing who you are is an attack on yourself, on your physical body. Sorry, part of this is incorrect. It's not Jane Bolton. Dr. Margaret Paul talks about the connection between shame and our attachment to control. So, because shame can be so overwhelming, she suggests that if I take responsibility of that shame and I make it my problem, then at least I have some control over it. So I can change something so that I can prevent being rejected by others. or I can prevent getting negative feedback from my environment. Sometimes we punish or attack others. I'll talk a bit more about what that looks like in our communities. Sometimes we withdraw, right? So often we talk about depression as being chemical, which it is and can be. What if it's also a response to a community, a cultural context, a social setting that activates our shame regularly? Then is my dysthymia, my depression, in response to anticipating rejection all of the time? Maybe I defend against shame by avoiding it, by investing in something that gives me a lot of validation. Maybe that's what I'm trying to do when I'm scrolling endlessly through Grindr and Scruff and not actually receiving a lot of responses. Maybe that's a shame avoidance strategy. A psychoanalyst might call it managing a narcissistic injury. So investing in something that's a bit more superficial. Well, what are the sources of shame for gay and queer guys? How many of us played with girls' toys as children? Yeah, I was obsessed with combing out the hair of all the dolls until the hair was gone. It's my biggest fear of my own hair. Not to make light of other people's trauma. I would call that little t trauma. How we are scolded, or how we develop ways to continue doing the things we desire but in hiding, right? Because at an early age we know that we might be punished, or if it's not punished, at least we know it's not going to be celebrated, right? And so we internalize that message so early in our lives. Whenever we challenge gender roles as young people, we get punished. Well, don't really do that. The girls do that. Until this day, I go to a person to get my hair done. He does a great job, but I can't get my eyebrows done at his place because he won't do these lovely sharp things that I like. He says, that's for girls. And I want to say to myself, well, in my head, I say, fuck you. That is so rude. So then I go to the Indian auntie down the street she knows exactly what I want, and I want to look like her. I want to look perpetually shocked and very intimidating. I went to East Africa to visit family just in May, and I was buying like some traditional clothing. And the men's garments have these really long arms, and so I said to my aunt, I'm like, I want the ladies' arms, the ones that like cuff here so it looks like I have some arm. And the person we were buying from said, oh, no, that's the women's style. And I had to stop I was around a lot of middle-aged women, and thank God I know the language, it really helped. I stopped everyone and said, okay, we're not going to talk about what men and women wear. We're just going to talk about which style and fit works for me. And then if you want to charge me extra for the seaming, I will pay. But it's hard to do. It's so hard to do, right? Even as a 30-something, it's hard to do, right? And when we're young kids, we're like messaged to about what we should do and not do. All of the activities we encounter at school, in public spaces, recreational centers, all kinds of things are all gendered, right? And we develop our self-consciousness around others because those segregated gendered spaces have their own culture that we have to participate in. So then we're being socialized about how to behave in men-only spaces. What does that mean? How does that impact us? Anytime you have to do an assignment that you want to do well in, because a lot of us have grown up wanting to really overcompensate, and so this is a thing we threw ourselves in, we're not studying anything. And I know this has changed since I've been in middle school or high school. But by and large, we're not studying anything that reflects our diversity of experiences. There's no history books that talk about how we have contributed to the country or the world in the shape that it's taken. And so we're constantly figuring out where we fit in. And so inadvertently, we understand ourselves to not fit in, right? In the same way that, you know, South Asian literature has no place until you've learned all of your core courses in British literature, and then you can try to do some extra learning, right? On the margins, of course, and that onus is on you to do. We watch film after film that not just presents a dialogue or a story about heterosexuality, but celebrates it. The wedding is such a big deal. The gown, the suit, the bachelor, the bachelorette party, the gender reveal parties, everything is such an effing big deal. When people in my family get married, we fly. There's 400 people flying across the country. For what? What are you celebrating exactly? We celebrate children in the same way. And children are a beautiful thing. They're not that hard to create for a lot of straight people. So much celebration, though. And it's not that I don't want to partake in that celebration, but it's that living on the margins, we're thinking from a much earlier time in our lives about how we might not be able to participate in that. And it's fine that the law allows us to do that in this particular place and time. It's still not the same. We still have to grieve the loss of not being able to do it and then figure out how we might reintegrate it into our lives. So much emphasis on playing of sports. People talk about sports in such interesting ways. It's connected to our national identity. So if you like sports, it makes you a good citizen of this country. It makes you a good man. It gives you a way to connect with other men. We talk relentlessly about how sports build character. And it's not that they don't sometimes. They're also extremely difficult spaces to navigate, even for cisgender straight men. A lot of us might have experienced difficult moments of participating in toxic masculinity. So I almost never passed as straight, as you might have gathered. But there were, believe it or not, small moments where my sexuality wasn't held against me or wasn't questioned. And in those moments, when I wanted to be like one of the guys and they would accept me, I would absolutely participate in saying derogatory things about women or making fun of other more femme guys. If you could believe that there were more femme guys. But what an awful way to be in the world. What an awful way to think you have to behave to survive, to navigate spaces, and to be accepted, to put other people down. Is that not an internalization of competition, colonization, oppression? The pressures to date and handle conflict in certain ways. I got into so many fights in high school. Not in high school. Oh, I wasn't fighting then. I was retreating then. But so many fights in middle school. What's that about? My family never used physical fighting in the home. And yet it's something I relied on when I was at school. And I have no doubt that people at school thought that I came from a troubled home. I think I was maybe feeling like I wasn't enough, like I couldn't fit in. I wasn't white enough, I wasn't masculine enough. And so handling conflict meant being outspoken, being the class clown, sitting in the back seat, almost failing grade 3. These are all forms of communication. And they're all ways that I'm finding to take up a space when I've already internalized an idea that there isn't a spot for me at the front of the room or in the center of the room. How do we all anticipate rejection around our sexuality before we've even walked into a space? How long did we anticipate rejection and loss before we decided to come out? Whether our families accepted us or they didn't, or it was something in between, I imagine a lot of us in the room had to think long and hard about the consequences of sharing something so basic about who we were. Not only did we have to share it, not only did we have to share something so basic about who we were, we also had to have it packaged, and we had to be ready to educate other people. We had to be ready for all the questions they might have. We couldn't just explore it. Hey, I'm thinking I might be attracted to guys. Hey, I'm really in love with Nick Carter from the Backstreet Boys. It just wasn't accepted. There's some claps for the loving of Nick Carter. That's great. I want to celebrate that. When the Orlando massacre happened, I think a lot of us were really shocked. We were really surprised. I think what happened there was something a lot of us feared could happen to us. I think there was a time in our lives we thought that we were a walking target and that we were very, very visible, and we would be attacked for that visibility. And we had different ways of being in control of whether or not we were visible. Some of us were able to do that better than others. And I think we're not just talking about people from countries and other places. We're talking about Canada. We're talking about big cities. We continue to fear homophobic violence every day. How is talking about HIV in our community a source of shame? Some of my clients talk about it being another layer of disappointment for them. My family and my friends, they already kind of had to deal with me being gay, and that, I guess, was a kind of disappointment or failure. They had to readjust their expectations for me. And now they think my diagnosis, which should just be a chronic illness in this day and age, but now my diagnosis, they see as terminal in their mind's eye, means that I failed again. What if things are going well? What if I'm in a healthy, loving relationship? I have a great work life. I've got friends and family. And me and my partner decide to be in an open relationship. Why do we hesitate to talk to our straight friends and family about the fact that we've decided to be in an open relationship? When we know that, yes, it's complicated, but by and large, it strengthens our bond. It's taken us to places of communicating things that we could never otherwise articulate. We've processed and talked about our shame in ways that we would not otherwise be able to. And yet we're worried about talking about this thing that's so big in our lives. It's a freaking accomplishment. What do we worry about? How will they see us? And is it just them? How do our other queer and gay friends see us when we talk about our openness? Do they see it as a failure? Do they see it as a Band-Aid for a relationship problem? What are the narratives? I mean, it could be all of those things, but what are the narratives that they project onto us that we then internalize? And then start to see ourselves from their eyes, because that's what shame is. I start to see myself through your gaze, which is a judgmental one, and I internalize those ideas. What are some of the sources of shame, particularly for me, as a racialized gay man? I think we don't talk about class enough. So I think about the times growing up, not just about being too femme or liking to play with dolls, but when I asked my dad to drive me to school, but to drop me off a block away from the school so I could walk the rest of the way, because I was ashamed of our car. Yeah, it's funny, and also how awful that must have made him feel. There's no way he didn't know why I was asking him to do that. How was I ashamed of my immigrant parents? I actually, at a young age, thought, oh, they look so different from other people's parents. They talk differently. They confuse their W's and their V's. I really would like it for them to not meet any of my white friends. It seems that body hair is very popular now, and so I'm happy. And so I'm happy about that. That's great. I think it might have been a particular group of people in our community that was responsible for setting that trend. I don't know that it was people who have hair on their bodies, when they come out of the womb, or people who have a lot of hair in places by grade 3 and 4 that they don't know how to make sense of. So the relationship to body hair, right, which grows on my body from basically my hairline up here to my toes, right, is a source of shame, or at least was. Because this is the thing that made me not white. This is the thing that made me stand out in gym class. drew more attention to my body that also was already very uncomfortable in a gendered space. What does it mean to internalize the white gaze? To start to see yourself the way you think white folks might evaluate you. How much do I hate it when a white person says, "You speak very eloquently, you speak very well," but also how much do I love it, right? Well, I'm not gonna not be honest about that, right? When you've internalized the white gaze, how do you see people from your own communities? And how do you then understand desire? Do you desexualize other people that look like you because you understand another type of body that shows up in the world? It just happens to, not through any modification, just shows up that way, as taller and broader shouldered and fairer in skin tone. How do you start to see that as more attractive? And what is the impact of that, externalizing that shame? Because then we can't love one another, us people who come from the same community, because we're competing with one another. And that's an example of internalized racism. But internalized racism is more than desire. It's, if my shoes aren't polished, will they think it's because of my race? If I don't give enough of a tip, will they attribute that to my race? If I don't shave or I don't look a certain way at the airport, how will that go? As a brown Canadian-born person, what are the things I've learned to do to separate myself from people who are the same color, look the same way as me, but are more recent immigrants? How do I compete or work to stand out in a way to declare citizenship or try to claim citizenship in a way that's unhelpful to other people that are subject to oppression? And how do I internalize Islamophobia? As a Muslim person, whatever that means, a Muslim person who doesn't necessarily care that much about God, but is very connected to rituals and community and culture, what does it mean to be anxious every time you hear something on the news about a bombing or some kind of terrorism, and all you think is, I really hope it's not my people? And how do you have to defend yourself constantly? Before you're even asked, you're prepared to defend yourself. Well, not all Muslims are blah, blah, blah. Why should I have to do that? Yeah, some of my people are backward, and a lot of my people are not. And that is true for white people, too. Why do we... What about talking explicitly about pleasure? How many of us have challenges around that? Some people are really good at it. I'm a therapist who talks to people about sex and relationships all the time. And then in my own relationship, just things like, do a little bit more of this, a little less of that. Ugh, I'd rather not. Sometimes I can, but then there's a portion of times where I'd rather it just be over. What's that about? Why is sex not about pleasure? Or how did it begin being about pleasure, and then I checked out, and it became about something else? I think a form of trauma that a lot of us can carry is internalizing expectations from our communities and families. To be the first this, to succeed in that way. And when you can't, or you no longer want to have kids, or a big wedding, and you've mourned those losses, what are the other ways you continue to seek family approval? I went and I got way too much education, which was good for me. And I got some family approval, but they have no idea what I do. And so I've spoken to a number of people, not just racialized people, but a lot of queer folks who have internalized expectations around family and the way they've adaptively, if you will, tried to compensate and seek approval, has been to invest in other forms of achievement. And it's so strange that, those were great for their careers and their lives, but they resulted in other forms of isolation. Because then you're like, have access to all kinds of language, and you have even more of a gap between you and the people you love. So let's take a breather. I'm going to get some water. So if we put our shame on hold, right? I'm coming out. Does somebody want to sing this chorus for me? Seriously, give it a... No, okay. Well, I'm coming out. I want the world to know. What else? What are her lyrics? I was trying to get you to sing it. Okay, it's not working out. That's okay, that's okay. I think we have so many beautiful moments, lots of diva anthems that bring out celebration and joy and like really important moments where we reclaim our identities, where we feel celebrated, where we love ourselves and other people. You know, the Monday morning after Pride is over, and they're sweeping Yonge Street and Church Street, it's full of filth at that point. And you think, oh wow, will this amazing feeling continue to last? Or will it fade? And sure enough, a few weeks in, it fades. I mean, if you've used great drugs, it fades sooner. So what is this imprint of shame, and how does it permeate our communities in the most insidious ways? How does it continue to live on? I'm going to suggest that it interferes with gay and queer men's desire and pleasure. It shapes our motivation for partner seeking, how we do it, what we look for. And I think shame reinforces a lot of HIV stigma. I'm going to give you 3 case scenarios of clients that are completely made up. And after I read out the description or the case scenario of each client, I'm going to then give you some questions. So as a therapist, I love to ask questions. And when I supervise students and they're worried about their modalities and how they need to approach clients, I say, let's slow down. Let's think about some good questions. And so I'm going to present some questions that I would present to each of these people. Maybe not right away, but they're at least things that I'd be curious about. So let's do a case scenario that talks a bit about shame and desire or shame and pleasure. Lucas, a 36-year-old white man born in Ontario. He came out to friends and family over a few years in his early 20s. His primary caregiver was his aunt, and it was important for him to come out to her. When he finally did, she became withdrawn for a period, but eventually said she supported him. She asked that he remember his family values and be cautious about AIDS and HIV. It's been 10 years since Lucas came out. Today, he struggles with how people perceive him in a predominantly straight workplace. Both the dating and sex are largely on his mind, but they are either seen as too much work or dissatisfying. He uses crystal meth occasionally when he wants to have fun, let loose, and have great sex. Here's some questions I might have for or about Lucas. What was the impact of having to hide your sexuality? What messages did your aunt's withdrawal or her initial withdrawal send to you? What aspects of you do you think people perceive as inferior? Have you perhaps paired fear with sex? Do you worry about rejection? When did you first start to anticipate rejection? What did you do? What was your behavior? For a lot of us, that's when our depression or anxiety sets in. It's so adaptive because it protects us in those moments. Who do you get to be, and what kind of sex do you get to have when you use meth? Oops, sorry. Those are some things I'm curious about. Let's talk about partner seeking. Rohit is 25 years old, South Asian and Canadian born. He grew up in a family and community that celebrated big when people got married and had children. He's known that he's not straight for a while, but it's a difficult reality because he's always wanted a traditional wedding and family. He worries about what his family and extended relatives will think if they ever find out about his sexuality. Nevertheless, he's got an online profile and is interested in meeting guys and dating. He is seeking somebody who, quote unquote, has it together. Career-wise, hopes to come out to his family once he's in a relationship. He experiences a lot of rejection from gay men, but maintains his confidence while trying to meet, quote unquote, mask guys and those who take care of themselves. So I'm thinking about how shame impacts how Rohit is seeking partners. I'm also thinking about how his partner-seeking process affects more than just him. Here's some questions I have for Rohit. What is it like for you to go to wedding after wedding, know you may never have a celebration that looks quite like the ones you attend? What will it say about you if you don't have a traditional family? Does it bring you closer to normal or the norm to come out while you're in a relationship? How does the anticipation of rejection from your family and other gay men impact your daily life? I don't know many queer and trans folks who don't have anxiety at least some of the time. I wonder where that comes from. How do you compensate for being different? And is there room for self-compassion in your life? Are there moments where you can say that you are enough, you've done enough, you are enough? And would your relationship pressures look different if you had the space to grieve your losses, right? Of who you won't be, of what you won't get, of what won't get celebrated, of the ways you will not be seen. And then I think about shame and HIV stigma. Gavin is a 42-year-old Asian-Canadian gay man who had a tough time growing up. He is relentlessly bullied for the lunches his family packed for him and for being feminine. His quote-unquote deficits were only further highlighted when he had to participate in physical education classes and when he didn't get into his first university of choice. Gavin's parents know he's gay, have a positive relationship with his long-term partner of 15 years, but the relationship is not talked about much. Gavin and his partner are in an implied open relationship, which they don't talk about. Gavin asks guys their HIV status multiple times before meeting them and believes that he will have to end his life if he ever becomes HIV positive. And just some context. When I thought about this, I drew it from a number of people who think this way in present day, in the age of good treatment and PrEP. It's not about objective risk, really. It's about what it represents to a person. Here are some questions I have for Gavin. While you were being bullied, did you ever have friends or allies throughout your school years? What were the kinds of supportive things they said or did to you? Say or do for you? What messages did you internalize about yourself as an Asian person? How do you feel about being a femme gay man today? Realistically, what would showing acceptance of you look like for your parents? What do you expect? Sometimes we have to have compassion for ourselves for wanting something that we might not get. And then we have to have compassion for towards people for not being able to give us what we want, only because they don't understand it. Is communication in relationships a threat to your sense of stability? What does the gay community teach us about people who are HIV positive? And finally, is there a relationship between fear of HIV and your long-standing fear of failure? Let's all take a deep breath, shall we? So we defend against shame, right? We have to protect ourselves. So I suggested that we punish or attack ourselves. What does that maybe look like in our communities? Sometimes it looks like having significant HIV and STI anxiety when we actually objectively have low to no risk. The number of times I've told people that they're at negligible risk for oral sex and it has not reduced their anxiety astounds me. Because it's not about their objective risk. If you feel really bad about the sex you're having, you think back to who you met, the kind of sex you had, the person you had sex with, or even the setting. With a sex worker, at a bathhouse, at the back, in a dark corner in a bar, and you rewrite that setting as risky and dangerous and bad. That's where your anxiety comes from. You think you need to be punishing yourself. And HIV and STIs feel like a perfect fit. Excuse me. If you feel bad about having casual sex because the world has told you that it's irresponsible, it's a thing that you just do on your way to monogamy before you settle down and meet the right partner, then you're going to feel bad about it. And if you feel bad about it, you don't necessarily have the opportunity to work through it. Instead, you might say, well, this is the time I'm going to look for a monogamous relationship, right? And of course, a monogamous relationship isn't bad, don't get me wrong. But in this context, I'm punishing myself for doing something I wanted to do, I set out to do it. I likely didn't have casual sex by accident. I mean, you can. But like, in general, I would have put some effort into it. I might punish or attack others. That's another way to deal with shame. How do we attack each other in this community? Sometimes we reduce gay men to only wanting sex, as though it's a bad thing. But we say it in this like derogatory way, that's all they want, that's all they know, that's all they understand. What we're upset about is all the difficult feelings that come up when we try to participate in the very culture that does centralize sex. But that's difficult for all of us. We say things like, our community is too promiscuous. Or we say, we're married. We're married to the idea of being non-seen. I want to meet a guy who's non-seen. What's that about? What is the subtext of that? What are you saying about the guys who are part of the scene? Please, by all means, don't change what you're looking for. Don't. That's not what I'm trying to get you to do. But let's think about how we create hierarchies of what's valued and celebrated in our own community as a way to manage the difficult feelings that come up for us. I have to find a way to make myself above you so that I can manage the difficulty of the shame that I'm experiencing. Maybe I have a lot of resentment about other people's experiences. He gets all the guys. I'll speak from my own experience. The times when it's really difficult for me to separate somebody's white privilege and just my resentment that they're maybe having a better life than I am. How much of it is it about their whiteness? How much is it about my shame from somewhere else, where they become a canvas that I can project that onto? What a freaking complicated thing to even think about or process. And with whom? My white therapist? Another defense against the shame is to withdraw. Sometimes people will say, oh, we have different libidos, or I'm not that sexual a person. Sometimes that's true. A portion of the time, that's a dirty lie. It's a way, it's something my body has done, our bodies have done, to shut down so that we can continue to participate in a way that takes the pressure off. Then I don't have to have all these difficult relationship conversations. I don't have to talk about pleasure. I don't have to talk about jealousy. I don't have to talk about shame. I don't have to talk about how I might not feel good enough. What I call social anxiety might be a form of withdrawal. right? Social anxiety protects me from not going into social spaces or from leaving them early. I was out for dinner yesterday with some people, and I didn't tell anybody, and I just settled my bill, and I left. And some of those people are smiling right now. And they were like, is everything okay? And I said, yeah, I'm over it. I hate this place. I got to get out of here. And I was just having a moment of feeling very overwhelmed, and withdrawing made a lot of sense. So it's not bad. It protected me. I went home, I went to bed. That's a great thing. If I do that all the time, it's going to affect my relationships. Without word, you know? Cab, I got to go. How do I defend against shame in an avoidance way? In a way where I tap into narcissism or a narcissistic shame avoidance strategy. Don't get me wrong, narcissism is not a dirty word. Narcissism is about our fear of being erased, of being decentered. It's the part of you that gets activated when you feel like you've been disrespected before something has even happened. And so then people experience you as a big personality, as too sensitive. But actually, a part of you that has struggled with shame for a long time has been activated, and you're defending against that. And the way you're defending against it is not being necessarily validated or appreciated by other people. Sometimes it does result in bad behavior, but it's a defense against shame. In our community, I would argue that perhaps our focus on gym culture and bodies, sculpting them, letting people know when we're on miserable diets, the more miserable you are, the more points you have, is a shame avoidance strategy, right? I can let you know about the control I have in my life because shame makes me feel not in control. Because where does shame come from? Different forms of trauma. I'm just going to revisit my takeaway messages. I think we encounter shame in a number of social experiences, particularly around sexuality and sexual identity. Our culture teaches us that we seemingly undo this shame by coming out, forming relationships, having sex, reclaiming our autonomy. But shame lives on and leaves an imprint, and its residue stays with us. We protect ourselves against this shame, but sometimes the way we do that isn't always helpful for us or our communities. Shame is painful, but it's important to talk about. And we need self-compassion and authentic engagement with our feelings that are connected to shame. So loneliness, shyness, embarrassment, self-consciousness, and inferiority. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahim. That was great. Very, very thoughtful. I also want to thank everyone who's presented this morning so far. So Rocky, Florence, Bill, and Shane, thank you. Nate and Rahim, thank you very much for opening for us this morning. If you want to hear more from Rahim, you can join us on Saturday at a community event over at the Pump Jacks. Information is in the program. And for now, we're going to take a break, and we're going to reconvene at 11:30, where you'll have some options on concurrent sessions. If you're like me and you can't decide, maybe one thing to note is that the sessions that are happening in 1900 and 1700 are being recorded. So if that helps you make your decision at all, you can keep that in mind. But we'll see you at 11:30 at one of the sessions. Thank you.